Okay, so my pet peeve is people chewing with their mouth open. For me, I think this comes from the traditions and rules that I had around the dinner table growing up. As a little girl, I'd sit with my family, and my grandmother is very strict. And so, aside from saying it's both rude and disgusting to chew with your mouth open, it's also a waste of food. And that if I'm going to chew and have my food go everywhere, I can just as well throw it out. And so, for me, this idea stuck with me as I grew up. And reflecting, I think how lucky I was and am that I can chew with my mouth open because I do have access to food and I do have food security. And so I started considering, where does this fit in an international level and what international law might apply. And so I started with the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and looked specifically at Article 11. And so that identifies our right for an adequate standard of living and adequate access to food. And so I used this as the foundation to kind of build off of, and I looked at two aspects. So first at food and then at security. So in the context of food, I looked at food waste, our need for access to food, and our right to food. And then in the context of security, I looked at something very specific, and I looked at what sort of protections are there for food in an international armed conflict and a non-international armed conflict, and how might we better increase access. And so this I found very interesting, and so I looked at what international law best applies, and that's the International Law of Armed Conflict, or International Humanitarian Law. So IHL is founded in the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and ultimately mandates the rules of war. But it's looking at what sort of protections are there for civilian populations, who are the protected persons, and what sort of resources do they need to have. And so in the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 23 looks specifically at medical supplies, at clothing, and looks at foodstuffs as essential to the civilian populations and identifies the need for safe passage of these resources. The additional protocols in Geneva Conventions also look at the need and access of food for prisoners of war and civil internees. And so these rules are written and they're signed by states to the statutes. And therefore states have an obligation to follow them. But there are also customary international humanitarian laws which also concern this issue. So, for example, it's prohibited to use starvation as a method of warfare, as is it prohibited to attack, destroy, or render useless any sort of useful civilian object, and so that includes foodstuffs. And so these issues are continue to be challenged, especially as we see an increase in non-international armed conflict. And so I see there to be three main challenges to protection of foodstuffs in conflict. First, as a result of shrinking humanitarian space, it's difficult to ensure that there is access. This is because the capacity for states or non-state actors to provide humanitarian aid is challenged because of a lack of IHL and lack of understanding of certain obligations that party to the conflict might have. Second, as a result of asymmetrical conflict and an increase in non-state actors, their understanding of their obligations is also not always clear, and that provides a challenge for the implementation of IHL. And lastly, because of a change in environmental conditions and because of climate change, we're seeing an increase in natural disasters and in droughts, especially in areas that are in conflict. And this is also posing a challenge. So I see there's two best ways to combat this. First, to further the dissemination of international humanitarian law, so especially to youth and to non-state actors, as they are becoming increasingly relevant in the care and legality of conflict. And then also looking at better coping mechanisms or disaster preparedness in states or areas where there is conflict and where there's a high likelihood of disaster. And so these I see as the best way to combat this protection of food resources, especially in conflict. For me, I find it disgusting and irritating and rude for people to be chewing with their mouth open, but it's not just limited to that. I find it's frustrating for me the thoughtlessness towards food security, especially for civilian populations in conflict, and I think it's important to consider as well.